Greetings Captains, I am Yusril and welcome to the guide video for the Fleet Starbase Defence. This came in with Season 6 of Star Trek Online and runs with a minimum of 15 players despite being balanced for 20, and that gives rise to the first problem you'll have to deal with. If you are running this with the minimum of 15, Delta Group will have no escort initially assigned to it. You can see that the game has split the players evenly amongst Alpha, Bravo and Charlie here, and we've just had to pull a few people off each of those groups to make sure that Delta has got at least a couple of starships covering it. While you've got yourself sorted out, and you've got several minutes to do so, because it's a good 3 minutes until the shots are fired in this mission, it is absolutely critical that you remember which facility you escort freighters to at the beginning, because you're going to be going back to that facility in a hurry several times over the course of this mission. Once the freighters reach their jump points, the first of two waves of enemies will warp in. This is phase 1, and there is nothing particularly special about it. The groups of enemies warp in relatively clumped. The second group will warp in once you're more or less done with the first. So they're pretty much perfectly set up for a gravity well, followed by an absolute mass of AoE attacks. As an aside, there is one theory that basically says that you split the escorts off into their own little blob and have them going around and essentially disco-infernoing the waves down one at a time at each nav point with massed cannon scatter volleys. It works, but you do have to have cruisers and science vessels evenly spread among the other three groups, and you do have to ensure that whoever's tanking at all four groups is very good at fighting a delaying action until the escorts can show up and get rid of the problem. As I said, the second wave will warp in, and since I zigged there when I should have zagged, let's show you the death penalty. You get the usual 15-second timer, and yes, it increments if you die repeatedly within a 2-minute spell. If you go 2 minutes without dying, it does reset back down to 15 seconds. The kicker is that you respawn at the starbase. So in phase 3 in particular, you are faced with a 30-second run at full impulse to get back into the fight, and while this probably won't be the end of the world, it is a complication you don't need. So while this is a horribly obvious bit of advice, can I recommend that dying should be avoided. Once you've cleared out 2 waves at each of the jump points, phase 2 will begin. You get 30 seconds warning to get back to the starbase, get yourself sorted out, put out the fires, replace any consoles that have exploded, shove the bodies out an airlock, whatever you need to do. And then the biggest zerg rush you're ever likely to see outside of Cure Space Elite going wrong will dump in on top of the base. There is a key point to be noted here. The enemy ships will warp in at about 9.5 kilometers from the base, which means they will be able to start firing on it pretty much immediately. While it's tempting to slap gravity well on them right from the get-go, this should be avoided. It is much safer for the starbase, and remember that defending that is the object of this mission. To use tractor repulsors or photonic shockwave or heavy graviton beams or any other knockback you've got, to first shove them out of range of the base, then use gravity well to make sure they don't wander back in. Obviously, if they're out of range of the base, they can't shoot it, which is going to make your life much, much simpler. That starbase may well have 500,000 hit points, but there are so many enemy ships and so much incoming fire that even with a ton of healing, the base will go down under sheer weight of fire. The bonus to this, of course, is that by shoving the enemies away from the base, you also shove them away from each other. You break up the zerg rush, you reduce their ability to support each other, and perhaps most importantly of all, you reduce the chance of an errant fire at will getting you the attention of 20 Klingon ships and blowing you away 10 seconds later when your defensive cooldowns run out, which, as you can imagine, is a fairly bad thing. This phase does tend to just devolve into a melee, particularly in pugs, So fortunately it's not an instant mission fail if the base does go down. You can see there we are, what, a minute and a half in, and we've already lost 250,000 health off the base, even with several hazard emitters, shield extensions, and Lord knows how many tactical and science teams and shield extends we're chucking at it. The base isn't really going to hold simply under the sheer weight of fire that's being thrown at it. And yes, there are reinforcement groups. Again, you get a second wave of attackers warping in. However, frankly, this just degenerates into one massive brawl. One chap did just use scramble sensors there. Personally, I don't rate it in this scenario. While it does provide an excellent temporary confuse, the duration is generally so short that you're better off using tractor repulsors just to get them out of range and achieving the same effect that way. Mostly because it will take them far, far longer to get back into range, particularly if you then follow up with gravity well, target engines, power drains, Titan's Rift, you name it, anything to slow them down. That's pretty much phase 2 in a nutshell. It's actually quite fun, even if it does tend to stress the engine perhaps to its limits. You'll notice that a lot of effects simply aren't rendering, particularly gravity wells and such like. That's an engine thing, not a limit on this scenario as far as I can tell. For phase 3, once you eliminate off all the enemies in phase 2, you get another 30-second count. Remember which facility you initially escorted the freighters to? Get back there in a hurry. You are about to get another 2 waves of enemies at each facility. Again, the second wave will warp in once you're more or less through the first. The twist, however, is that the real threat is purely the enemy heavy cruisers, battleships, however you want to class them. In this case, of course, it's the Negvars. If you're up against Orions, it'll be Slave Masters, Federation, probably Sovereigns, or a Sovereign variant like the Majestic. These ships will attempt to get into close range of the facility, and then they'll do that. They will begin beaming sabotage teams on board. The sabotage teams will drain health at the rate of about 1% per second per ship that is draining. So you can see there that the Fabricator is taking more than a bit of a beating, 77, 74, 73. We've got too many people at the shipyard, so I'm just going to break over to it as soon as I can get back into full impulse. This always seems to take far longer when you really need to do things in a hurry, which is why it's a good idea to get this right in the first place. You can see that the Negvar is sitting there, well, it's being molested, but it's not really dying fast enough. A far quicker solution is just to shove it back out of range and then break out a gravity well to make sure it doesn't try anything funny. Unfortunately, their second wave has just shown up at the exact same moment. They're also being hit by the gravity well, which means that I have gotten that entire wave aggroed on me. I really should have popped a blade of armour at this point because, yeah, boom. That's a little embarrassing. It's also a bit of bad luck, because the second wave just happened to be there, and like an idiot I dumped gravity well in there as purely a delaying action. You can see the second Negvar has gotten in along with its escorts, and it will also attempt to move up. Now this is why being in phase 3 and dying is so bad, because I now have a long dash back to the Fabricator to try and get back into the fight. Again, you can see that the Negvar is merrily sabotaging away. Again, we'll dump in a tractor repulsor, shove it out of range, and stop the rot that way. And with a bit of luck, I think I had this. Yes, I did. Gravity well, just to make sure it's firmly out of the fight. So we can pretty much ignore that, mop up the Raptors and the Vulture, and then move on. The damage control teams, by the way, require you to be in fairly close proximity to the facility. You can do it once per facility and it will restore 5% health. So you can literally buy yourself 5 seconds. If, of course, you've got both ships running sabotage duty, then that's 2.5 seconds. Phase 4, the final phase. This will begin once you've cleared out all the enemies in phase 3. You can regroup at the starbase, but what I prefer to do is regroup at the facility I was originally escorting past, because that puts me right behind them. The key vessels in this phase are the siege dreadnoughts. Everything else is simply an escort, a distraction, or a line breaker. The dreadnoughts, however, will attempt to close to about 20 kilometers, give or take, from the starbase, and they will begin charging a very large gun. If that gun gets to 100%, you can basically kiss goodbye to the starbase. The starbase itself, by the way, will miraculously heal itself to 100% at the start of this phase, so no matter how much damage it took in phase 2, you don't have to worry about healing it up during phase 3, you can just ignore it and get on with the practical business of blowing away enemies and defending your facilities. You don't have to heal it up, you don't have to get yourself bent out of shape. You can see there that the Bortus has begun its charge cycle. You know what I'm going to suggest if you've been paying attention to me for the last few guide videos. It can't charge if it's out of range, so bring forth the tractor repulsors, ladies and gentlemen. What you aren't in range to shoot at, you can't hit. You can see the progress bar has disappeared. Now the AI will do one of two things. Usually it will attempt to crawl back into range and recommence charging the main gun. So a gravity well just keeps it pinned, keeps it stopped. Obviously all the other slowdowns are handy here. Oh yeah, and Bortuses in particular have transphasic torpedoes, so it's not a good idea to fly down the throat of one unless you're about to use tractor repulsors or a similar knockback, because bad things tend to happen. The other thing the Bortus can do is go wildly off mission. It will attempt, as it is doing here, to kill the irritating little science ship that just shoved it back. Now, I'm all for this, because if it's trying to behave like a normal ship, it's not trying to get its job done. So as far as I'm concerned, that is a mission kill, and we can pretty much leave that to its own devices, feed it a few distractions, and break away. Now, that dreadnought's taken a few hits, so we'll get some passing shots in. However, that other Bortus is more or less charged up, so let's go and deal with that instead. Again, science vessels, this is where we get to shine, because positional control, particularly with gravity well and tractor repulsors, and of course beam target engines, one which we get free of charge, is something we get to excel at. It's not quite our raison d'etre, because we tend to be regarded as healers more than anything, but we can play absolute havoc with an enemy in this mission and the blockade, because we can pretty much deny them indefinitely, and do so solo by just diving in and out of range. Now then, do I have my second tractor repulsors on cooldown? Yes, I can. Bingo, problem solved. It's now firmly out of range. The progress bar is gone. And yes, I think that is about to go off mission as well, which will make me a very, very happy science officer, because that is basically a second mission kill. Yeah, there we go. The AI has gone back to its normal mode. That's another mission kill, and the whole problem is basically solved. Meanwhile, our friends have knocked off one of the other siege dreadnoughts, and we have got this very nicely under control, so there's not much else to talk about here. The mission itself ends once you eliminate all the vessels attacking the base in Phase 4. Again, if you've kept the starbase intact, you get bonus fleet marks. Typical playtime for this is about 20 to 25 minutes. Typical reward for a good performance will be 25 fleet marks. Yeah. So again, as I've said before, Cryptic seem to be setting up for about one fleet mark per minute for a competent performance, which I hope, ladies and gentlemen, this video will help you attain. I am Yusril, and if there is a next time, I'll see you then.